Hi everyone, welcome again. In the last video, we saw how to annotate a class with @configuration annotation, and we saw how to use @bean annotation to define or to configure a new bean. But this is not the only way to configure a class as a Spring Bean using annotations and Java-based configuration. There are one more way to do that. So in this video, we will see what is the other way to configure a class as a Spring Bean. Before we do that, let's revisit the project structure. So in the config package, we have the app config, which has the Spring specific configuration. Then in the DAO package, we have a user DAO class, which is a simple class with a void returning method, fetch user by ID. Then in the handler, we have the same request handler, which we used in the config with @bean annotation. Then in the service package, we have user service. This again is a very simple class. So let's see how can we configure these classes as Spring Beans without using @bean annotation. There are three more annotations provided by Spring which we can use to configure a simple class as a Spring Bean. And these annotations are @component, @service, and @repository. So we can use any annotation to annotate a class in order to configure that class as a Spring Bean. So we can use @component, @repository, or @service. Once we annotate a class with one of the annotations, and when Spring initializes the context using the app config or the class that has been annotated with @configuration, then it will scan that class and it will know that it has to manage the state of that class. All right. If we can use any annotation, then why do we need three annotations for the same purpose: @component, @service, or @repository? The function of these annotations is the same. The only difference is where we put the annotation. So component is a general annotation, a general purpose annotation. We can annotate any class with @component, and Spring will treat that class as a Spring Bean. Now, service annotation is generally used to annotate the service classes, the classes which belong to the service layer. Similarly, repository annotation is used to annotate the classes which belong to repository or data access layer. So in this example, let's see, we have the handler class. It means when we first accept the request or when we first start up the project, this is the entry point. So the handle method will be used to start the execution for a request or for a call. So that is the simple class, or you can say the entry point of the application. So we can simply annotate it with @component. Now we can have a service layer. In this case, for example, let's say we are writing a program to fetch the user from the database. Now the request handler doesn't need to handle the request by itself. What it can do, once it has the request, it can call the user service that, hey, I want a user by this ID. So this is the service class that we write. Logically, it belongs to the service layer of the application. Now, the service class has a simple method get user. Again, it may be doing some transformation or validation, but the responsibility of fetching the user from the database belongs to the data access layer. So we have another package DAO and another class user DAO. So when service calls the user DAO, then user DAO will talk to the database. It will fetch the user from the database. And once it has the data from the database, it will return that response back to the service. Now service again can do some transformations or validations, and it will return the final response back to the request handler. So that is generally the flow of a Java application, where we split the project or split the flow into different layers: service layer and DAO layer. So generally what we do, although we have three annotations, so we annotate the general purpose classes with @component, the classes which belong to the service layer or all the service classes with @service annotation, and all the DAO classes, data access objects, with @repository. All right, so let's do that. Let me remove this code, because now we will be using @component to mark request handler as a Spring Bean. So let me remove that. We don't need @bean annotation anymore. We still need the app config file and @configuration, because otherwise Spring doesn't know where to start. Here we can annotate this class with @component and service with @service, and similarly user DAO with @repository annotation. Now that these classes have been appropriately annotated, it means that Spring can identify these classes as Spring Beans, and Spring should be able to manage these classes. So let's go back to the main method and let me print this as well, handler. And if we run the program, and this time we see an exception which says that no qualifying bean of type this available. So what we did, we initialized the application context. We passed application config, which is annotated with @configuration. And once the application context is initialized, we called the getBean method and asked for the request handler class, an object of this class. But we got an exception saying that there is no qualifying bean of this type. So Spring doesn't know any class which is of type request handler. Why is it so? We correctly annotated all these classes with the correct annotations @component, @service, and @repository. So Spring should be able to initialize and manage these classes, and Spring should be able to return a new object of this class. Well, there is one more thing that we need to understand, that even if we annotate the classes, how does Spring know that I have to look for this class? How would Spring scan the project? Because it will go to the app config, because this is annotated with @configuration, and it knows that this is the configuration file that I have to read. Spring doesn't know where to scan those classes, so we have to tell Spring where to look. Now that is where another annotation comes into the picture, and this is component scan. Component scan tells Spring which packages to scan for Spring Beans. We provide a package path to Spring, and Spring will use that package and all the sub packages to look for the classes or to look for the Spring Beans. So here we see that all these classes are under this package. So we will say that this package and all the sub packages. To do that, I can simply copy the root package, and in the end I will say star. This means scan this package and all the sub packages. And in all those sub packages, you should find the Spring Bean if available. This time, if we run the program, we can do the same thing with other classes, user DAO and service. So let's do that to verify that @repository and @service annotations are also working fine. Class, and similarly user service dot class, and we can simply print the object. And we see we got the objects for all these classes, DAO and service. So it worked fine. The important thing to understand is that we need to provide a configuration file and the component scan if we intend to use these annotations. Now, one more thing that we need to understand is that when we are calling getBean method, we are passing the class type. So request handler dot class, user dot class. So when we do that, Spring container or IOC container will check if it has a class or a bean of this type. because it has a bean of this type, so it will return the object. That is one way to get the object. We can additionally pass an ID of a bean. So what do we mean by that? If we get the same object of user service but using ID, so we will do something like this. Get bean, and now we need to pass the ID. Service. So we see there is an error. It says that provided type is object and required type is user service. The reason behind this is because get bean returns an object, and so we have to typecast. So what we can do, we can either apply the check here, or if we don't want to do that, we can pass additional parameter here with the class type. Now if we provide the class type, then Spring will know that whatever object I get by this ID, I need to typecast into this type, and that's why we won't have to add the cast here. So let's print this object and let's see if we get a non-null object or a valid object. So we see we got a valid object, but if we go back to this class, we can see that we have not provided any ID. Then how is Spring Container able to identify the object by the ID? The reason is, if we don't provide an ID explicitly, then what Spring Container does, it automatically assigns a new ID to the bean. And to get the ID, what it does, it uses the fully qualified name of that class, and it then converts that name into the camel case. So because the name is in this case is user service, and if we convert that into the camel case, the ID will become like this. And that's why when we passed this ID to Spring context, Spring was able to identify the class and the type, and it returned the object back to us. So there are two ways to get the object. Either we pass the class type, or we can pass the ID as well. So in this video, we saw how to use these annotations. We saw how to use component scan, and we looked at how to get objects back from the application context using the class type and the ID. In the next video, we will talk about bean scopes. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching.